This film is a fictionalized inside look inspired by real World War II factories and engineering breakthroughs. At 2:17 a.m., the hall glowed like a sun trapped under a roof. Long rows of steel columns drinked the light of forge fires and arc welders. The air tasted of hot metal and oil. Sparks fell in slow, glittering curtains. Men and women moved like shadows at the edges of furnaces, their faces streaked with soot and concentration. Somewhere beyond the test cell doors, a machine was howling, a thing of pistons and steam, of valves and valves fury. And for a moment, its noise became a single animal heartbeat that the whole factory seemed to hold. Then the heartbeat broke. A searing crack tore through the test cell. Glass shivered and a panel bent inward. Sheets of white-hot metal parted with a sound like a rifle shot. A shower of spent fragments arced across the concrete, striking like hail. For a breathless second, no one on the floor moved. Then the radio crackled, orders flew, and men in heavy aprons ran the liturgy of emergency. Cut power, douse flames, check the pressure gauges, sweep for casualties. A test that had been planned for an hour had been undone in a single violent instant. In that moment, the building ceased to be anonymous machinery and became a crucible of demands. The machine inside the test cell was not merely an engine. It was the keystone for a plan no one on the floor dared say aloud more than necessary. The nation wanted a fighter, an Italian fighter, housed and assembled inside these very halls, that could do what the skies had never required before. Range that stretched like a promise, speed that cut lines on maps, reliability that lasted through bombing runs and the furious mathematics of attrition. Experts in armchairs had called it implausible. Engineers in the blueprints had called it perilous. The factory called it imperative. They were told it was impossible. They answered with molten metal and sleepless nights. If you admire stubborn engineering and the people who sweat to make the impossible practical, leave a comment below. Tell us whose hands you think deserve credit. From the first spark to that first catastrophic failure, the work in this facility followed a single, unforgiving logic. If the problem could break a prototype in minutes, the answer had to bind metal in ways the textbooks did not foresee. The crucible for that logic was an assembly hall the size of a church, its windows darkened against enemy observation, its roof punctured by skylights that let out the heat. On one side, an iron mesh of lathes and turret machines. On the other, benches where draftsmen bent over paper like priests over scripture. Between them, the test cells, thick-walled chambers soundproofed behind plate glass, where engines were made to scream and the room kept a slow count of time in the rhythm of crankshafts. Frederick Brackett was the man they called when metal refused to behave. He was the chief metallurgist, a broad-shouldered engineer with a tendency toward quietness and a pocket full of cigarette butts he never burned in the lab. He had the look of someone who had learned to read alloys as if they were letters, a thermometer of microstructures, eyes that noticed the grain of a cast as much as any inspector noticed a crack. Brackett's job was less heroic than it sounded and more exacting. He was responsible for convincing metal to take a shape and keep a promise under conditions that made older metals sing and then fail. Samuel Ortiz was 22. A young mechanic with grease soldered to the nicks on his palms. He had come from a coastal town 3 trains away, and a mother who wrote him long, spidery letters folded into tobacco-scented envelopes. Samuel's hands were fast. His mind was faster. He could tune a fuel pump by ear and strip a valve assembly blindfolded, though he preferred to do both with eyes wide open and the answer clear on the bench beneath his hands. On quieter nights, you could find him at the drafting table, trying to understand the drawings the draftsman made into reality. Harold Wentworth kept things honest on paper. He was the draftsman, the one who found poetry in tolerance and rhythm in the flow of oil lines. He drew the engines so that workers like Samuel could read the life inside them, and he argued with the engineers in a precise, inked language that never needed to be loud to be fierce. Together, they were the human lattice that held the factory. Together, they would test, fail, retool, and test again. The strategic question, which in any documentary of war reads like a ledger of human priorities, was simple to state and hard to live with. An air arm's reach was limited by the size of its tanks, the hunger of its engines, and the confidence of its mechanics. In this story's context, the fighter's mission was not narrow. It was a stretched demand. Extended escort missions, deep reconnaissance over hostile territory, the ability to clamber into thinner air without surrendering speed. To do that, the engine had to be both powerful and life, able to breathe at higher altitudes, to shrug off overheat, and to run for hours without shedding its skin. Those constraints translated into a list of enemies that made every designer wince. Overheating was an executioner. Vibration was a thief that could steal bearing tolerance in a single flight. Detonation could tear pistons apart in an instant. Materials, the basic vocabulary of the shop, were not simply chosen, they were negotiated with. Each new formulation of metal meant a new set of tempering techniques, new fixtures, fresh tool bits, and a new risk of unexplained failure. On paper, the suggestions from government technical boards were categorical. Use existing alloy recipes, keep to proven tolerances, and build in redundancy. On the shop floor, the rule was simpler. The plans were a beginning, not a boundary. The men and women in that hall had to invent continuations to make up where the paper fell short. That creative work, the rewrites in steel, was where the factory earned its name. The failure montage came as a sequence of small tragedies, each one a teacher that did not always give up its lesson willingly. First, a crankcase split along a hairline fissure that had been dreamed away in an illustration. The sound was a low, metallic sob, and the cast fell in two like a broken shell. Then two connecting rods, bored for minimal weight, began to flutter in resonance with a particular RPM. They bent outward like the spokes of a wheel thrown off balance. Cylinder heads, kept dutifully in ovens to relieve stress, wrapped themselves as if heat had memory and decided to twist. Every failure brought specialists into the room. Vibration analysts with slide rules, machinists with micrometers the size of a child, and metallurgists with samples so small they might as well have been talismans. Brackett took to harvesting fragments, twisted valves, charred piston crowns, blotched bearings, and examining them with a tenderness that surprised those who only ever saw him in meeting rooms. Where others saw waste, he saw a fossil record of error. One evening, a test cell shook the building with an explosion that scattered spent bolts across the floor. It was a catastrophe carefully designed by physics, a lean mixture at high compression that had decided to detonate rather than burn. For hours after the incident, the crew moved in a kind of stunned deferential choreography, sweeping for shrapnel, checking the ventilation ducts, counting the bolts that remained. A foreman taped together the fragments of a gouged cylinder and put them on the bench as an argument. This is what we are up against. The factory's rhythm became iteration. The engineers would introduce a change, a thicker skirt on a piston, an alternate oil gallery, a different casting technique. Then they would run a test, sometimes only for minutes, sometimes for what felt like a mercy of hours. Each run produced a new defect, or, increasingly rarely, a sliver of success. Sometimes the solution to a problem created a problem twice as cruel. Beefier components increased weight and therefore decreased range. Smoother running reduced efficiency in another RPM band. The heart of the task was not to win every skirmish, but to balance the bleeding until the machine walked. Small human stories anchored the arc of failure. Samuel received news from home that his brother had been wounded in a coastal raid. He carried the letter in his pocket for a week, the ink blurred at the fold where grease had met grief. Harold, who had once sketched planes for pleasure and found them stiff and honest in his line work, began to draft at night in a tiny lamplit room, altering intake geometries that might help an engine breathe at altitude. Brackett, who had been unwilling to speak about his family at the plant, left a newspaper clipping under a bench for Samuel to find, a photo of a factory crew from 1918, hands dirty and faces young. The clipping read like a reminder: wars cycle, and men with hands make the choices people later ascribe to strategy. The equipment itself became a character with moods. The foundry had its own vocabulary: crucible hiss, the singing of a ladle, the temperament of a mold. The heat could be generous and cruel. Once, when an experimental alloy cooled with a favorable microstructure, the men in the foundry paused, as if someone had stopped a bellows mid-breath. They did not clap. They simply nodded and then, very quietly, carried the ingots to the machine shop. The most persistent antagonist was not one failure, but the cumulative erosion of confidence. You can manage a single catastrophe if you have the tools to correct it. You cannot easily keep a team together when the work is week after week of near misses and small deaths. People quit to go to safer shifts or to factories that promised steadier work. Others stayed, finding in the routine a meaning that needed no fanfare. This is what it is to repair the world, one bolt at a time. Out of those repeated failures began a set of incremental innovations, small adjustments that read like improvisations at first and then like system changes. One idea came from observing how heat pooled in a single part of the cylinder head. Brackett suggested reconfiguring the coolant passages to chase heat away rather than bar it inside. It was not an elegant fix in the drawings. It cut across the grain of established manufacture and forced machinists to recenter jigs to file the soft edges away by hand. Yet, when they validated the changes on a bench, the local temperatures stayed steadier longer. Another breakthrough began with a timid suggestion about the intake arrangement. Harold asked, in a voice used to arguing tolerances rather than policy, if a small impeller mounted ahead of the compressor could pre-pressurize the incoming air at low speeds. It was a front-mounted solution, counterintuitive for a people used to hiding equipment behind cowls. The idea borrowed from larger machines that used blowers in unusual ways. Taken down a size and married to the fighter's engine, it promised better throttle response and less lag at critical moments. The test riggers laughed at first and then built a model because they had to know if such an idea would sing or wail. Supercharging, the ancient friend of altitude performance, had to be rethought. Single-stage blowers gave way to a vision of multi-stage compression that allowed air to be progressively nudged and cooled between stages. That cooling proved crucial. Compressed air heats up, and hot air is less dense, exactly the opposite of what a high-altitude engine needs. So, alongside the compression schemes went an inquiry into cooling, into heat exchangers small enough to fit on a fighter, but efficient enough to make a difference. These were not neat inventions that appeared overnight, but stitched together assemblies where a small louver here and a thin wall passage there could swing the balance. Metallurgy, though, remained the gravest theater. The alloy they needed had to resist high temperatures without growing brittle, to keep tight tolerances under cyclical load, and to be producible at scale. Existing recipes offered trade-offs. One alloy would take heat but not shock. Another would flex but then creep under prolonged stress. Brackett and his team began to explore alternatives, minor additions of elements that relieved thermal stress, heat treatment cycles that altered internal grain without compromising toughness, casting techniques that reduced porosity. They tested samples in salt baths and then in hydraulic presses, watching for grain boundaries to hold together when everything else seemed determined to unwind. The test cell runs in this period took on a ritual aspect. A new part would be installed, the controls were secured, the room would fill with the low murmur of men checking instruments. For each run, someone read out the checklist with a cadence that felt like prayer: timing, fuel, pressure, coolant. Then the power dialed up and the engine gathered itself. Some runs ended quickly, nearly before they began. A valve would release, a bearing would seize, but occasionally a run would stretch, feed itself on nominal conditions, and whisper the possibility of endurance. One night, a test lasted not minutes, but nearly an hour. The engine's timbre changed subtly from a raw, jagged note to something smoother, as if it had found a metaphorical steady breath. The temperature gauges climbed and steadied. Oil pressure held. Vibration dampeners showed numbers that suggested not perfection, but survivability. Men who had paced the floor like wolves laid down to watch, leaning on crates, cigarette embers doing a slow march to ash. When the engineer finally brought the RPM down, they all exhaled like a crew that had steered a storm and lived to tell the tale. Someone laughed, a sharp, intolerant sound that cut through the room's relief. Samuel grinned like a child at magic. Harold unrolled fresh paper and began to redraw the intake as if he had found a clearer line. Yet even that success carried an aftertaste. It had been fragile, dependent on precise tolerances that mass production might not honor. The jump from one successful test piece to dozens of identical, reliable units is a leap as fraught as any maiden flight. Tooling, jigs, casting molds, all had to be robust enough to make that leap. The factory's leadership began to calculate not just how to make a perfect engine in a lab, but how to make thousands that would tolerate the small slippages of a wartime production line. Worn cutters, imperfect casts, hurried assemblies. The pressure of that scale drove other more bureaucratic dramas. Procurement argued with design. The supply chain could not always furnish the rarer alloying elements in the quantities bracket preferred. Shipping constraints meant that certain machines designed for delicate finish work might sit idle while other parts were prioritized. The plant manager, who spent his hours balancing output quotas and the practicalities of human fatigue, walked a thin line between urging on speed and preserving the integrity of what could be achieved. Into this maelstrom came a prototype airframe, the one intended to house the engine prototypes. Its existence amplified the stakes. The fighter, for the purposes of this tale, was a compact bird, streamlined, with a fuselage designed for minimal drag and a canopy that gave pilots a broad sweep of sight. The designers, sitting in a room with daylight poking through blinds, had argued heatedly about weight. Every ounce saved was fuel that could translate into range. Every unnecessary sheet of armor was a sentence against endurance. Mounting the engine to that fuselage for the first time was like fitting a heart into a chest. It required alignment tolerances surgical in their precision. The mounts had to take torque without flexing. The cowling had to channel air so the front-mounted impeller could breathe without turbulence. If the assembly was improper, the result could be catastrophic at altitude, flutter, loss of control, or a sudden drop in thrust. That first integration was scheduled to be conservative. Mechanics matched datum points. The gearbox interfaced with the propeller shaft. The cowling was bolted in place and rechecked. Harold, who had offered initial intake sketches, watched the fittings with a face that betrayed an agitation he rarely allowed. Samuel tightened the last bolt, and then, as if to steady himself, tapped the flange with a hammer he had used since his apprenticeship. The sound struck the air like a small affirmation. The day set aside for ground runs became a study in nervous competence. The pilot assigned for taxi tests wore a leather helmet and a face that suggested both eagerness and an understanding of risk.
He was not a celebrity. He was the kind of man trained to make cold calculations under pressure, to trust instruments over rumor. They warmed the engine, they ran the systems, they checked controls. The city beyond the factory boundaries hummed with other wartime factories doing their own mathematics of necessity. When they advanced to higher throttle settings, the assembly, for a moment, seemed to hold. The cowling pulsed, the impeller breathed, the instrumentation showed acceptable flows.
But then, at a mid-range RPM, an oscillation began, faint at first and then insistent. The pilot felt it in the stick as a skin-crawling resonance. Gauges twitched. Someone in the control room shouted the reading. Mechanic and engineer exchanged a glance that folded the fatigue of the preceding months into a single calculus. They cut power. The cause, when examined, was not a single villain, but a chorus of small misalignments. A mismatch in the torque curve, a slightly shifted mount, a gasket that had lost a millimeter in its compression. Each of these things on their own would have been a tolerable annoyance. Together, they sang the recipe for instability. It was a demoralizing day, yet they did not let it become a stoppage. They returned to the benches, to the jigs, and to the grindstones. Brackett ordered a new run of samples with altered chill rates in the mold. Harold redrew the mounting brackets with a small but critical change in the bearing placement. Samuel and his crew softened the bolt points and changed the torque sequence so that the mounts would settle differently under dynamic loads. The calendar turned. There were nights when the shop hummed with the lone instrument of industry, lamplight over a lathe, the whisper of concentrated cutting oil, the patient recitation of a test checklist. And then, in a lull that seemed like mercy, the parts began to fit with a smug kind of grace. The impeller's ring engaged as if it had always been supposed to be there. The cooling channels measured out their labor in smaller, steadier rises. The vibration graphs took on a smoother line. Hope, however, is a slippery thing on a factory floor. The team knew better than to celebrate too early. The leap from a few laboratory successes to a reliable production standard was not a linear path. The risk was always the same, that something like a shipping delay, a change in raw material, or a moment's carelessness at an assembly bench could undo weeks of progress. They had to put robustness into the machine, not just beauty. And yet the breakthrough ideas kept coming from unexpected places. One night, a mechanic suggested using a thin-walled sleeve inside the exhaust manifold to reduce back pressure. The solution seemed crude at first, but turned out to smooth the pressure pulses in a way that reduced detonation risk. A toolmaker on the floor devised a jig that cut 10 minutes from a complex fitting without sacrificing tolerance. Small economies of motion accumulated into meaningful resilience. As spring edged toward summer, the team set up what they called the endurance run, a multi-hour test designed to mimic conditions a fighter might face on long-range missions. It was a test of heat soak, of vibration over time, and of the small erosions that turn a reliable part into a liability. The endurance run would be their first attempt to prove that these engines were not only capable in bursts, but dependable when stretched. The test cell doors closed.
A hush fell, which in a place used to noise felt conspicuous as a prayer. Monitors streamed numbers like constellations on the wall. The engine came alive, a low, steady hum that grew into a machine's voice. Men leaned with hands on consoles, eyes glued to trends that could turn into alarms at any moment. For 47 minutes, nothing tragic happened. The gauges climbed and then plateaued. Temperatures rose within tolerable ranges. Oil pressure remained consistent. Conversation on the floor was a careful whisper, not from fear only, but from respect. No one wanted to tempt either fortune or hubris. At 52 minutes, a subtle change registered. The oil temperature crept upward in a curve that suggested a slow accumulation rather than a sudden spike. A technician nodded toward Brackett. He squinted at the spectroscope readings and murmured aloud, "Trace element shift." Brackett, who had learned to listen to instruments as if they spoke with human timbers, frowned. He asked for a sample of the circulating oil. They drew it, watched it, and the lab confirmed a minute but growing concentration of metallic particulates. The particles were not large, not yet catastrophic, but they were the beginning of a narrative he had read too many times in other shops. A story of bearings taking a long, patient toll until they failed without drama and then with violence. They reduced power. Engineers traced the path from pump to bearing to gallery. The fight, as it had always been, was between speed and caution. If they ran the test to the end at full power, they would get data on the machine's breaking point, useful for design but dangerous for production deadlines. If they curtailed the run, they risked losing critical endurance metrics. The debate was not abstract, it was personal. Somewhere inside the plant, other runs were scheduled, components were waiting to be machined, and wartime timetables had already carved out penalties for delay. Yet, Brackett made a decision that revealed the moral center of the shop. They would not try to extract an artificial victory by forcing a test to a ruinous end. They cut the run and took their data. When the engine wound down, the room exhaled in the same measured way a congregation leaves a service, quietly, with hands already returning to work. The sample they collected would lead to new metallurgical trials, to altered filtration, to possibly wider oil galleries. Each fix would be a compound sentence punishing precision and rewarding patience. Even as they worked on resilience, rumors of operational use began to trickle in from the front. Pilots asked for longer endurance. Commanders drafted flight plans that imagined an airframe with this engine climbing over new theaters of operation. The factory's output, should it scale, could enable missions that until then had been imagined only as possibilities. But the men in the plant were careful with predictions.
They knew the moral landscape of their work. Every marginal gain in range or power could be used to protect or to destroy. They refused to let the ledger of technical achievement drown out the human accounting of consequences. On a particular morning, as dawn made silver laundry of the roof, a telegram arrived requesting that the prototype be made ready for a demonstration flight in 3 weeks. The message carried a tone that was both imperative and pained. Operational planners wanted to see whether the design could alter strategy. The plant manager read it aloud in a meeting that had no applause. Faces tightened. Some men exchanged weary smiles. Others met the requirement with a practical calculation. More tests, more parts, more nights. Brackett stared at the paper as if the ink had weight. He could see, as clearly as any man who dissected metal, the line where ambition could slip into hubris. Yet he also understood that engineers sometimes had to deliver in order to preserve life, to grant pilots a better chance at survival. The factory's work had moral consequences, and there was no avoiding them by proceduralism. The question was how to do the work so that the consequences, whatever they were approached with craft and conscience. They set a schedule. The prototype build accelerated. Harold retooled drawings for production variants. Samuel trained a second crew in the new torque sequences. Brackett adjusted his lab's priorities to test batch samples rather than single specimens. The foundry ran nights to produce spare parts. The machine shop reallocated cut lists, and men who had been scheduled for leave postponed plans. It was the old pattern, sacrifice piled upon sacrifice, offered in the quiet promise that something reliable could emerge. Yet beneath the forward drive lay a persistent shadow.
The name of the machine, the Italian fighter nobody expected, remained, for the purposes of this film, an INDE. The facility had assembled an airframe whose provenance and specific service history are left intentionally blurred here. The story, instead, treats the factory as an exemplar of the technology and the toil that might surround such a plane. The aim is not to claim a precise archival lineage, but to enter, with fidelity to process and mood, the world of those who fashioned engines and airframes under wartime pressure. As the deadline approached, an undercurrent of anticipation and dread threaded the shop. The team knew what a demonstration could mean. A successful flight could accelerate production against a backdrop of need. A failure could not only cost lives, but also shutter credibility for innovations that had required months of labor to reach a plausible maturity. The factory, which had so often been a place of incremental faith, now faced a ceremonial test where the stake was not only an order number, but also trust.
On the eve of the demonstration, a small group gathered near the test cell glass, watching an engine idle like a noble animal. Outside, the air smelled of early summer and oil. Inside, the mood was reverential. Samuel stood with hands in pockets, the same letter from his mother safe in his locker, as if he had learned to carry two kinds of obligations at once, one to home, another to the unromantic work of not failing. Harold traced the engine's cowl with a fingertip like a benediction. Brackett watched the gauges and read the instruments as other men might read scripture. The factory held its breath, waiting not for a miracle, but for the patient efficacy of craft. They had come far from the first violent failure. In repair and redesign, they had found new tolerances of courage. They had also learned restraint, to call off a test that might give useful data, but at too high a human cost. To pick small battles that secured slow, reliable gains. In those choices, there was an ethic of engineering that seemed to guide them as firmly as any spec sheet. The demonstration would not be merely a show of speed or endurance. It would be a ritual of validation, the machine's first sentient performance outside the sanctuary of the test cell, exposed to weather and pilot judgment. It would be the moment when the sum of all oxides, alloys, sleepless nights, and tiny inventions either coalesced into an instrument of flight or unspooled into another series of partial failures. As the last shift left and the lights dimmed to an amber hum, the men of the plant went home the best way they could, some with families, some to single rooms, others to companionships of tired men. The engines on the benches waited like patient beasts. The drawings lay on desks like maps of future possibilities. Outside, the city continued its rhythms, unaware perhaps of the particular tensions in one building that might ripple into other theaters. Morning would bring the trial, but the story the factory lived was not a single day. It was a long apprenticeship in adversity. Their work was a pattern of attempts and adjustments, of people who learned to read failures as instruction manuals and to translate insight into a language production could speak. The world beyond required machines that worked. The factory required people who kept faith with the machine while remembering the moral weight of what a machine enables. As dawn cracked the sky, the plant hummed to life on another machine cadence. Men grouped by benches, tools were checked, and the flight mechanics briefed the pilot who would ride the prototype. There was an unspoken agreement among those present. Whatever the result, they would all return to their benches and begin the tough work of learning. The doors to the test cell opened with an industrial sigh. Engineers in helmets and goggles lined the observation room around the glass, faces haloed by the glow of control panels.
Samuel felt a tremor in his hands, not from fear only, but from the accumulated pressure of months. He thought, briefly, of his brother and of the letter, and of the small joys that made a life worth defending. A good meal, a letter read in the dark, the shape of a drawing that finally made sense. The engine fired. Its sound had a clarity now that was almost a conversation. Vibrations registered and then settled like a hand laid carefully on a pulse. Monitors ran across the board without an alarming spike. Temperature curves extrapolated to tolerable endpoints. For one elongated minute, the room lived at an angle of hope that felt both fragile and vast. Then a technician, scanning an instrument, leaned in and said two words that made everyone pause. "Watch the fan." Outside, the front-mounted impeller, the design that had been the product of 100 compromises, spun with a new patience. It moved air in a way that did not simply shove it into a compressor, but prepared it, warmed and smoothed for the next stage of compression. The chain of small inventions, altered coolant routing, a new sleeve, the slimmed intake, had come together in a way that the men had only dared picture. The reading on one gauge crept upward, then plateaued. No one moved to cheer. They kept watching, hands hovering near switches, eyes fixed on the rhythm the machine kept. The endurance run had been a rehearsal. This was the first time the engine sang with the aircraft as its body. Then, at the minute mark, a new reading flickered, a micro-resonance at a secondary harmonic, barely there but insistent. Those who had been around for many tests recognized the tone, not yet a catastrophe, but a pulse that could double into disaster if left unchecked. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, calm and precise. "Hold throttle, log values." Brackett's voice, when he finally spoke, was flat as an instrument reading, but carried all the weight of months of late nights. "We stabilize now," he said. "If that holds, we go to taxi." He looked around at his men. Their faces were lit by instrument panels, and for a second his eyes met Samuel's. A quiet, shared understanding passed between them. To keep a machine alive, sometimes you had to temper the desire for glory with the patience of incremental progress. The control room hummed, the pilot adjusted the throttle, and the impeller kept moving. The micro-resonance held in a way that stopped short of crescendo. It stabilized into an odd but manageable quiver that the crew could watch and record. Tools were at the ready. If it worsened, they would shut down. If it smoothed out, the team would have a candidate for the next step. They were balanced now on the edge of decision. The machine, obedient for the moment, held its promise. The workshop that had been home to failure and to small triumphs watched and waited for what the horizon would permit.
For a long minute, the room stayed taut, instruments folding and unfolding data into patterns only a practiced eye could read. Then, slowly, the pilot called for clearance to taxi. The workshop exhaled in tiny motions. Hands unclenched, shoulders dropped. Someone laughed under his breath like a man relieved of a bad dream. Samuel watched the aircraft roll past the observation glass. The prototype moved with a grace that belied the months of struggle, a relationship between metal and air finally beginning to be written in motion. Taxi trials were prosaic by design. They revealed couplings, steering geometry, and the way air gushed past radiators at speed. The pilot eased the craft along the perimeter of the field, each wheel and bolt tested by pavement and throttle. Harold stood with a pencil behind his ear, his posture a study in professional vigilance. He marked down small deflections and made notes about the cowling's flutter. Brackett watched the thermocouples and oil readings, numbers that had become more than digits. They were the voices of the machine. Nothing dramatic happened. Little anomalies, yes, a trim tab that required a nudge, an oil line that warmed more in one bay than another. All of them were predictable in the way of things that are tried and corrected. Each correction was handed off to a crew that had been rehearsing the choreography of fix and test for months. The prototype returned to the ramp and was inspected like a patient after a spell in the hospital. Touched, prodded, instruments checked, bolts torqued to the figures that had become talismans of safety. When the pilot reported ready for takeoff, there was an almost ritual procession. The canopy closed. The ground crew moved to their positions. There are duties in such moments that no one speaks of, but everyone understands. A cloth across a patat, a final wrench turn, a shouted confirmation through earphones. The engine came to life and folded into a broader sound that filled the hangar like a weather front. The impeller at the nose moved with a steady, purposeful spin, turning air into the promise of lift. Takeoff in any age is when abstraction becomes spectacle. The plane lunged down the strip, its tail lifting, the propeller stitching air into pressure. For a fraction of time, the things that had been debated and trialed and repaired, the alloys and sleeves and revised coolant channels, were no longer theoretical. They sang under strain, and the craft answered. The pilot eased the nose skyward, and in a movement both graceful and frightening, the prototype left the pavement. Flight changes every measurement into narrative. Climb rate becomes a sentence. The steadiness of a throttle becomes a paragraph. The pilot phoned back succinct updates, temperatures nominal, vibrations within expected bands. But it was the way the aircraft handled the air that mattered most. At altitude, the front-mounted impeller that had been mocked in early meetings revealed its value. Throttle response seemed calmer, surges gentled, and the engine accepted changes without the jagged protest that had heralded previous failures. Still, the flight was not without tension. At an intermediate altitude, the crew recorded a hiccup in manifold pressure. Not an eruption, merely an odd flattening of response when the throttle moved. It lasted seconds and then smoothed. The pilot later reported that it felt like a reluctance, a brief shyness in the engine's appetite that corrected itself. In the debrief, Brackett would call it an index card entry, something to watch, maybe a tweak in carburetor metering or a minor reshaping of an intake guide. It was not, in the calculus of the day, a catastrophe. It was a reminder that even a successful test can still be a beginning rather than an ending. The first flight accomplished what months of toil had sought, a proof that the design could lift, climb, and sustain power within the tolerances the men had defined. The pilot, returning with the calm voice of someone who has seen instruments behave and misbehave in their proper register, said one sentence that made the men at the benches exchange glances. "It's not perfect, but it's honest." Honesty in engineering is a rare virtue. It meant predictable failure modes, known margins, and amenability to production. For the shop floor, it was currency. They celebrated with a quiet that suited men who had grown suspicious of any loudness. There were handshakes and eyes that gleamed with the exhausted kind of pride that comes when craft meets necessity. Samuel found himself grinning at Harold, who had already begun sketching on a pad the small alterations he wanted to see for production versions. Brackett, who had spent nights hunched over micrographs, allowed himself a softer look, as if acknowledging that the metals had done what they were taught to do. News of the flight traveled fast along channels both official and human. Engineers in other plants sent telegrams congratulating the crew on the apparent success. Pilots at distant airfields asked for demonstrations. Procurement officers began to ask in bureaucratic tones about production timelines. With that surge of attention came a familiar pressure, the demand to move from prototype to quantity. It was a transition populated by new challenges: tooling for repeatable parts, inspection regimes scaled for tens of thousands of components, and a workforce large enough to drive assembly lines in shifts around the clock. The factory that had built the prototype shifted into a new rhythm. Benches that had once hosted prototypes now became templates for repeatable processes. Jig makers hammered out fixtures that would hold castings to tolerance. Women and men trained in new routines, learning torque sequences and assembly flows designed so that small mistakes would not accumulate into disaster. Inspection stations sprouted like new organs, Gauges, go-no-go pins, and microscopes to verify grain structure in samples pulled from batches. Quality control was no longer a department. It became a culture, a whispered insistence repeated at shift changes and in lunch lines. Scaling up also stretched supply chains. Where once Brackett might have asked for a handful of rare alloying elements, now they had to be procured by the thousands of pounds. The procurement office negotiated shipments, sometimes rerouting materials from other programs or accepting substitutes that required additional validation. Shipping convoys became part of the production narrative. Rail cars loaded with crucibles, crates of machined parts, and test rigs moved carefully under blackout cover. The geopolitical context added logistical wrinkles. Ports were congested, shipping priorities shifted with military needs. The men at the plant accepted these constraints with a practiced stoicism. They measured progress in crates emptied and assemblies completed. The human cost of scale was immediate and intimate. Long hours, night shifts lit by sodium lamps, and the constant hum of machines remodeled family life. Samuel saw less of his town. The letters from his mother arriving folded and stiff in his locker, becoming shorter as worry eroded their edges. Some workers suffered illnesses that were not dramatic. Eyes strained by poor light, lungs when inhaling abrasive dust, but which accumulated like rust on a chassis. Accidents occurred, sometimes painfully, and the plant responded with investigations and new procedures. The union representatives and foremen argued over break schedules and overtime, small moral economies that affected lives as much as any technical decision. Operational reports began to filter back from units testing the aircraft in theater. At first, vague notes of increased range, improved loiter time, and better climb in thin air. Commanders liked the idea of an escort that could reach farther, of reconnaissance missions that lasted longer without refueling. Yet the factory men who had built the machines were cautious about descriptions of battlefield effect. Brackett and his colleagues insisted on measured phrasing. A better engine, they said, enabled options rather than ensured outcomes. They had seen weapons used in ways that balanced between defensive necessity and offensive strategy, and they carried an ethical awareness of that duality. The ethical weight deepened with concrete reports of missions. Some sorties used the aircraft to protect convoys, shielding transport aircraft and bombers from interception. Others participated in interdiction missions that inflicted material and civilian damage. The documentary ledger here needs to be clear. Improved range and reliability were military capabilities, tools that could be employed for multiple purposes.
When those tools contributed to operations that harmed civilians, the responsibility extended beyond weapon designers to the larger moral frameworks that governed wartime choice. The men in the factory learned to accept that their craft would be used in complex moral landscapes and that technical excellence did not absolve ethical scrutiny. Post-mission debriefs also provided engineers with real-world data that no lab could simulate. Combat loadings, field maintenance, and the rough arithmetic of operations revealed wear patterns that suggested further refinement. Some engines returned with evidence of foreign object ingestion after rough field operations. Others showed corrosion from tropical climates not represented in the plant's climate chambers. Each return fed a cycle of improvements, better air filters, revised sealing, and more robust intakes that engineers implemented with both technical urgency and moral circumspection. Production, when it roared at full tilt, became a human phenomenon. The assembly line hummed with women and men whose dexterity and speed turned raw parts into functioning whole. In the lunchroom, the conversation ranged from tool talk to the weather, from small personal celebrations to whispered grief for lost friends. The plant had become a mosaic of lives welded together by necessity. Former farmers, mechanics, recent immigrants, and seasoned tradesmen. The management, including the plant manager who had once balanced quotas and fatigue warnings, began to place emphasis on rotations and rest to preserve a workforce that, though patriotic, was not inexhaustible.
In the middle of production, a strike of steel workers erupted at a plant in a neighboring state, a dispute over pay that threatened to choke a key supply line. For a fragile week, the production schedule teetered. Brackett and the plant manager negotiated, sent liaison teams, and adjusted workflows to use alternate suppliers. The plant's ability to adapt spoke to a broader truth of wartime industry. Resilience depended as much on social arrangements, the willingness of people to negotiate, to step into other shifts, to temper demands of speed with the practicalities of human endurance, as it did on metallurgical know-how. As months became years, the machine proved itself across multiple theaters. Maintenance crews developed field kits for the aircraft, simplifying procedures for quick turnaround. Training programs sprang up, teaching ground crews the idiosyncrasies of the engine and its systems. Pilots grew familiar with the machine's character, the moments of hesitation under certain conditions, the throttle settings that seemed to balance efficiency and longevity. Engineers read operational logs avidly. The factory received letters from airmen thanking the crews for machines that had kept them alive. Those letters were pinned at one point to a board near the foundry, a small counterbalance to the anonymous orders and production quotas.
But where innovation intersected with consequence, the factory often found itself in a reflective posture. The team documented missions and their outcomes and provided analyses that weighed technical trade-offs against mortal cost. Meetings at the plant introduced ethicists and chaplains into discussions of deployment, a practice not universal in industry, but increasingly common in places where people felt ownership of the outcomes of their work. These conversations did not stop military operations, but helped frame internal norms. To be deliberate, to consider durability over raw performance when possible, and to design with maintainability in mind so that crews in the field had a better chance of repairing machines rather than sacrificing lives. When the war finally shifted toward its later stages, the factory's output began to decelerate even as new demands arrived. The emergence of jet propulsion, the changing nature of air combat, and the end of some theaters of operation altered priorities. The plant that had once been all in on a specialized engine now faced a post-war question that many wartime enterprises confronted. What becomes of facilities, skills, and people designed for war when war recedes? The transition was messy and melancholic. Some machinists found work in commercial aviation as the industry sought to build passenger aircraft with wartime-honed robustness. Brackett's metallurgical advances seeded research into high-temperature alloys used in peacetime power plants and in early jet engines. Harold's drawings, the ones redone in the dim light of the shop, found a place in technical journals, referenced by engineers who would move aviation toward new frontiers. Samuel, who had once missed home, accepted a job with a civilian carrier, his hands relearning the subtler rhythms of a less urgent production tempo. For many workers, however, the post-war years meant layoffs and the slow unspooling of a life that had been constructed around the factory's demand. Some veterans of the shop became educators in trade schools, teaching a generation the crafts that had been essential to the war effort. Others turned to municipal jobs or to entrepreneurship, opening small repair shops where their expertise served mechanics and farmers rather than fleets. The plant itself, after a period, ceased the frantic rhythm of wartime production. Machines were mothballed or repurposed. The test cells grew quiet. A few years later, as an act of memory and of public history, a portion of the facility and several representative machines were transferred to a museum collection, carefully decommissioned, cataloged, and installed behind ropes and placards. Visitors walked through with a kind of reverence that mixed curiosity with a sense of distant obligation. The foundry's glow, once a daily reality, was recreated for exhibitions through light and sound design. The low thrum of an engine tucked into a loop, the warm orange light simulating molten metal. Children pressed faces to view panels, looking at gauges and imagining things they had never been asked to make. These preserved engines became teachers in their own right.
Curators placed explanatory placards that described metallurgy in accessible terms, the role of engineers and machinists, and the complex ethics of wartime manufacturing. Oral histories were recorded, interviews with men and women who had labored in those halls, capturing memories, from the banality of lunch breaks to the terror of test cell failures. Brackett's notes, Harold's sketches, and Samuel's signed tool list were archived together, artifacts not just of technology but of human endeavor. The historical record is careful to separate admiration from apology. Museums framed the machines within broader contexts, the strategic logic that drove innovation, the human costs of production and conflict, and the subsequent technological branches that grew from wartime research. Visitors could learn how an invention that improved an aircraft's range might also alter tactics in ways that affected civilians and combatants alike. The displays encouraged reflection rather than simple pride. In lectures and publications, historians traced lines from the plant's innovations to later advances in aerospace engineering. The idea of staged compression and careful pre-pressurization of intake air informed some post-war research into forced induction systems for both piston and early gas turbine engines. Alloy work that had focused on high-temperature resistance fed into broader material science investigations that helped enable the jet age. Yet those same histories always balanced accounts of technical progress with sober chapters on cost. The fatigue and injuries among factory workers, the destruction wrought when machinery served martial aims, and the psychological toll on those who had to reconcile craft with consequence. Decades later, when Harold's grandson visited the museum with a school group, he stood in front of the prototype engine and listened to a docent explain with gentle clarity how the machine had been born of both necessity and ingenuity. Samuel's name appeared in a small caption as one of many hands that had made the work possible. Brackett's handwritten margin notes were displayed under glass, a testament to the micro-decisions that shape macro outcomes. The grandson, who had grown up near the very neighborhood that contained the old plant, later said that he felt a strange pride tempered by gravity, an emotional mix that historians call the moral residue of conflict. The machine's technical legacy, therefore, was not a story of unalloyed triumph. It was an account of human problem-solving within limits and choices. The engines that left the plant gave pilots new reach and mechanics new problems to solve. They pushed metallurgy into regimes that later opened the gates for civilian innovation.
Yet they also were instruments deployed in a war that inflicted vast suffering. To study them is to accept a paradox. The same ingenuity that warms a hearth can also, when redirected, fan a conflagration. In the final chapter of the plant's narrative, the people who had been its heart came together for a reunion. Men and women who had once worked side by side in the glow of the forges, now elderly, hands marked by time, gathered near a displayed engine. They spoke softly, sometimes with laughter, often with the pause of people measuring what to say. Samuel, now older and steady, recounted a minor victory, a tool change that saved hours. Harold discoursed on the stubbornness of lines on a drawing. Brackett, who had retired to a quieter life of consulting, spoke of the necessity of humility in the lab. A small plaque was unveiled on that day. Its words were modest and carefully chosen. They commemorated labor, ingenuity, and the cost of making machines in times of war. It did not celebrate battlefields or claim miracles of single technologies. It thanked those who had worked and those who had suffered consequences. And it invited visitors to think critically and compassionately about what it means to invent under pressure. The coda of this tale returns us finally to the shop's sensory world. The oil-tinged air, the rhythm of a lathe, the quiet nods exchanged over a bench when a part fits as planned. Such scenes are small and, in their way, sacred. There where human minds and hands meet material constraints and fashion things that change history, for better or for worse.
The factory taught its people to read metals like scripture, to listen to engines like living things, and to temper ambition with the responsibility owed to those who would use their work in fields far from the bench. If this film has a single inheritance, it is this: ingenuity does not exist in a moral vacuum. To craft is to choose, and choices echo. The prototype that rose from the plant's trials was, in the story's terms, an Italian fighter nobody expected. An assemblage of alloys, ideas, prayers in the form of torqued bolts, and patience. It is a testament to human persistence, to the small, stubborn acts that turn impossibility into usable fact. But it is also a reminder that making machines for war carries duties that extend beyond efficacy. Duties to care for workers, to weigh consequences, and to remember the faces behind the metal. The plant eventually went quiet at night, as factories do. Lights dimmed, furnaces cooled. Tools were cleaned and set away. Yet the imprint of that work remained in the careers it shaped, the technologies it nudged forward, and the stories, often private, that the people carried to their families. In museums, in journals, and in quiet recollections at kitchen tables, the legacy was preserved not as a single narrative of victory, but as a layered account of craft, conscience, and consequence.
If this story has stirred something in you, curiosity, respect, unease, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the human stories behind machines and the moral questions they raise. There are more halls to walk, more forges to visit, and more histories that sit at the intersection of brilliance and burden.